I'm Matt Swaim, and Anna Mitchell, I was very saddened, as I know you were, to learn a longtime dear friend of the Sunrise Morning Show, very familiar to our Sacred Heart Radio listeners, Father Ted Ross, a Jesuit priest, passed away at the age of 89, and I don't know how to, sum him up. I was thinking about this. He was just an extraordinary guy. Some of our listeners may have heard his name on EWTN because he was actually a mentor to Father Mitch Pacwa. You know, what's funny, Anna, is that, when I came into the church, I, met some people who were trying to explain to me different religious orders, and people said to me, Jesuits, I don't know, you got to watch out for them. But really, the first Jesuit I think I ever met was Father Ted, and I was like, I don't know, he seems all right to me.
He was more than all right. I mean, a man of, I don't use this lightly, wicked sharp. This man was so smart, a professor of church history at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, which was why he was here in the Cincinnati area for so long. He spent his final years of life, and I was blessed to get to go visit him a couple of years ago at the Columbier Center in Detroit, Michigan. You couldn't find a kinder, gentler man. Even though, the external, he was so gruff and looked gruff, and he sounded gruff. I've got a couple of clips from Father Ted. One, an interview that he did long ago on the Sunrise Morning Show about St. Francis Xavier. So I wanted to read part of his obituary. It says, Ted was a devoted priest who loved the Society of Jesus. He was a natural and engaging entertainer who could hold one's attention for hours. People gathered around Ted to listen to his stories and laugh at his jokes. Some might say he had a sharp tongue, but all would say he was incredibly funny. He had an expansive understanding and appreciation for history, in particular church history. He was a gifted teacher who combined captivating storytelling and memorable stories in his classes, lectures, and homilies. Ted's pedagogical style tended to focus on the original texts and teaching history through gossip, quote unquote, with many jokes included. He encouraged students to seek out and read the original text as opposed to writings about the text. He would use stories, sometimes risque, flippant, or irreverent ones, to get students interested in the topic.
That is an understatement, by the way.
And help them to remember the historical facts. And so now I give to you Father Ted Ross from 2009.
There was one situation involving Xavier. He never, ever compromised his integrity. For example, he never went into a life of lust, but it wasn't because of his virtue. He had such a terrible fear of venereal disease that he kept away from anything that was improper that could possibly have given it to him. But Ignatius kept working on him. Ignatius described him as the toughest nut I ever cracked. Well, Ignatius finally reached him. And basically, Ignatius worked on him until finally he said, Francis, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and suffers the loss of his soul? And that's what got him.
Wow.
Well, so first of all, you got a taste of Father Ted. So I'll read the quote that he referenced later in that interview. This is what Francis Xavier says.
Yeah.
He says, many people here are not becoming Christians for one reason only. There is nobody to make them Christians. Again and again, I've thought of going round the universities of Europe, especially Paris, and crying out like a madman. What a tragedy. How many souls are being shut out of heaven and falling into hell thanks to you. I wish they would work as hard at this as they do at their books and settle their account with God for their learning and the talents entrusted to them. That's what Francis Xavier wrote back to the Jesuits who are kind of stuck in the ivory towers. How Father Ted described it, he said, Francis Xavier basically wrote to all the eggheads in Europe and said, you need to get off your duffs because people are dying out here without ever having heard the gospel.
The other thing that I want to share was Father Ted was an expert on Jesuit saints, obviously, but also an expert on Cardinal Saint John Henry Newman. And he gave a Theology on Tap talk here in Cincinnati a number of years ago, right after
2011.
Yeah, right after Cardinal Newman was canonized. And he would tell the story that, he picked up a sermon from Parochial and Plain Sermons. He read one sermon, and then he never stopped reading Cardinal Newman. He would read him every day. and became one of the leading experts in the world on Cardinal Newman, was speaking all over the world on Cardinal Newman at a time. But this is how he began his theology on Tap Talk.
I want to start off with one of my favorite prayers of Cardinal Newman. Dear Jesus, help me to spread your fragrance everywhere. Flood my soul with your spirit and your life. Penetrate and possess my whole being so utterly that all my life may be only a radiance of yours. Shine through me and be so in me that every soul I come in contact with may feel your presence in my soul. Let them look up and see no longer me, but only Jesus. I'm speaking tonight on John Henry Cardinal Newman. Now, I have to be careful. There's another John Newman who was canonized about 15 years ago, John Neumann. He was the Bishop of Philadelphia. When he was canonized, everybody thought it was the Newman that I study. And I got relics from all over the world on that man. I had enough relics to open my own morgue. But,
I
just had to share that.
I remembered where that story was going to go. And, yeah, I want to reference your time in the classroom just very briefly, because we did lose a dear friend over the weekend, Father Ted Ross, a Jesuit priest who taught with you over at the Athenaeum for a number of years. And I know that you passed him in the hallway and a whole lot more over that time, and you're remembering him as well.
Yeah, just two quick things that came to mind. That was a wonderful little piece of his talk that you just played. He had just this wonderful sense of humor. And what really struck me in his later years, the first story would be, he had some physical limitations in the last part of his life where he was using a cane. He had some difficulty with mobility, but he never lost that cheerfulness and that joy. So I'm sure he was in a lot of pain, but he could always lift up other people's, if somebody was discouraged. And I know he had some very close friendships with other Jesuits, even though he was living at the seminary. So he was just a great person of faith, and, had an amazing repertoire of stories. The other story is more personal. When my wife came into the Catholic Church after being an evangelical Protestant, Father Ross actually came and did a talk on church history, his area. And she was just very taken by him. That was, she had a chance to meet some really great examples and models of the faith, and that made it look, like this is really, they're people who can talk and answer questions and be kind, and not just jam something down your throat. So that was very helpful for her as she was coming into the church. So I'm very grateful to Father Ross for that.
I'm incredibly grateful to Father Ross for so many things. And he had an impact on so many people, among them Father Mitch Pacwa. Thanks for taking a little time with us this morning to remember Father Ted.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
How in the world do you, in a couple of sentences, sum up Father Ted to somebody who never met him?
He was a true genius. He was really, really smart. He wasn't, on one hand, he was nervous about what everybody thought of him, and he was funny.
Oh, he was as funny as anybody I've ever met in my entire life.
Yeah.
He was quirky. He was always the quickest wit in the room, and whenever I hear the word Jesuit, his face is always the first face that pops into my mind, because he embodied all those pieces of what it means to be a son of St. Ignatius.
Yeah, he really did. He loved the church. He truly did. And he sought to help people understand the church. He obviously came at a time and lived through a time of great crisis. We saw in the 60s, especially, the way that people were leaving the church. People inside the church were attacking it, and he took on the look at the history of the church and tried to help people understand it in its context and explain it well, and again with great humor. I oftentimes thought of him as the Hedda Hopper of historians. He also lived through a lot of this. He taught me and many others at the Jesuit school theology, and he taught at the seminary level. This was where he was able to use his background in history so well. He wanted to communicate to seminarians and future priests. This is what happened. Again, understand it in context. See, that, know that there were actual individuals with their foolishness and dumb ideas, as well as really wonderful people and saints. And so he was just terrific at that. And he was also very good at teaching Jesuit history. And he was also particularly good at teaching the writings of John Cardinal, now St. John Cardinal Newman.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a little bit, but he gave a Theology on Tap talk for us here in Cincinnati when Anna Mitchell and I were booking Theology on Tap. And in 2011, this was just a year after, I think it might have been less than a year after John Henry Newman was beatified, we were like, we got to get Father Ted into Theology on Tap. But that clip to me shows the range of Father Ted, because this heart for Christ combined with just, you never know what's going to come out of his mouth next. I mean, that was kind of Father Ted in a nutshell.
Yeah, exactly. And we used to say that taking notes in his class was like approaching a fire hydrant with a drinking cup. Because he was, when he was praying in that clip, he was kind of slow. But once he got into the subject, that boy was a fast-talking Yankee.
In the very early years of the Sunrise Morning Show, every time I looked ahead on the calendar and saw a Jesuit on it, I was like, I'm going to call Father Ted and see if he's got 10 minutes to unpack the story of this person. And every time he did, he found something that maybe we knew a little bit about this person, but didn't know it from this angle. There's one where Francis Xavier's a missionary overseas, and he sees all these people who don't have the gospel, and he writes back to all these complacent professors to really try and get them to understand the need for the gospel. Now that's the family-friendly, sanitized version of it. But Annie, do you have the clip for the Father Ted version ready?
I do. Here we go.
He has a famous letter. Matter of fact, it's read in the Divine Office. He wrote to Ignatius, yelling, "Get those professors at the University of Paris, get them off their duffs and let them do some work. Come out here. People are dying and never having heard the name of Christ." And so basically, it wasn't really a sacrifice. He was so on fire. Remember his motto, Domine, Dom mihi animas, Lord, give me souls. See, and so that he didn't want a life of high philosophy, theology, education. He wanted to work on those souls, and he resented the academics that were basically just doing abstract theology and philosophy. He said they belong over here. They don't belong at the University of Paris.
That sounds more like the fire hose version of Father Ted to me.
Yes, and actually that still was slow compared to when he got him wound up in class. He was moderating himself there.
Well, you mentioned that he was sometimes worried about people and what they might think of what he had to say and how he was, and he was a quirky guy, But you say you got some stories about that, right?
Well, one famous story in the province. He was going to have his philosophy exam. It's called the De Universo examination, and you had to explain. Any question. It was an oral exam. What they did is they woke him up early and trundled him down to the examination room. They told him that the exam was a few days later, but they did it this way and with the professor's connivance because he would have been so nervous that it drive him crazy. So, and when you drive Teddy crazy, he shares the wells back. It'll drive everybody else crazy too.
Yeah, he gives as good as he gets.
They trundled him down to do the exam. Of course, he did brilliantly well. He was more worried about his ability than anybody ever thought he needed to worry. But that just is sort of the way he was.
And Father Mitch, Annie's got a Father Ted story. I don't know if you've heard it before, but she's going to share it.
Yeah, I've been going through the Sunrise Morning Show archives since I learned of his death. I was listening to an interview that he did on St. Robert Bellarmine, and Matt had asked Father Ted, you know, was there any chance that Bellarmine might have been considered for Pope, because Father Ted had just talked about how, you know, Jesuits aren't supposed to be cardinals. And I had to laugh when I listened to Father Ted's answer, you know, in 2009 or whatever, saying, you know, talking about how hard it would be for a Jesuit to ever be elected Pope. And so now I take you to March 13th, 2013, and the election of a Jesuit as Pope in Pope Francis. And one of the places that I was very privileged to go that evening was to Mount St. Mary's Seminary here in Cincinnati to interview Father Ted Ross about the election of a Jesuit Pope. And he was so excited. But I have to admit, I don't remember anything of what he said in that interview, because it is all eclipsed by the episode that happened afterwards. And so Father Ted and I walked down the hall and went into the bar where all of the seminarians were celebrating the election of a new pope. And I have Father Ted, and the crowd of seminarians just erupted with applause when the Jesuit professor walked in the door. And so everybody's, you know, shaking his hand, congratulating him and all that. And then walks in Father Paul Keller, O.P., Father Paul Keller, a Dominican who was a professor of liturgical theology at the seminary at the time. And Father Paul makes a beeline for Father Ted, who was wearing, you know, just like jeans and a sweater, Father Paul in his full Dominican garb. And Father Paul goes, finally, a Jesuit gonna wear Dominican clothes. And then Father Ted goes, without skipping a beat, we're suppressing your order tomorrow. It was one of the greatest memories of all time, seeing these two together. It was just such a joy.
It was not easy to be faster than Father Ted when it came to repartee. I did it a few times. I took them on now and again, but you had to do so with great care, because you know, old Teddy would you know, come back pretty fast. But you know, when anybody in the province got him speechless, that was March as a banner day. And so, but he was so much loved.
You know, I've got a story from that's more kind of on the sentimental side, but also a little bit funny. So some of our listeners are familiar that my wife and I, for the first several years of our marriage, were not able to conceive. And Father Ted was one of the people I had praying for us. And so when we did become pregnant with our son, you know, he offered us a blessing in the course of that, and he was so excited for us. And when our son was finally born, he wanted to know what we named him, and we named him John Ezekiel Swaim, and we call him Zeke. And when Father Ted heard that, he said, Zeke, what's he going to be, a prospector?
Exactly.
And we got a great picture of Father Ted holding Zeke at just a few weeks old, and my son is squalling next to Father Ted, who's smiling, and they look like twins.
Son one bit.
They look like twins.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty good.
But do you got any other, maybe one more funny story of Father Ted that really gives us a sense of who he was?
There was one Jesuit, and he said, well, my sister Hortense is coming to visit us, and I haven't seen her in a number of years. And this priest had been, is a brother actually, had been over working in Rome. And he said, well, what's she like? He said, well, she's nothing like me. And Ted said, oh, I like her better already. It was just that kind of smart aleck comment that he would just come up with. And yet, it would be something that was, it would be like having one of those old-time comedians around the house.
Like a Don Rickles or something.
Yeah, exactly. You took that and you laughed, and he did it to everybody.
We're so grateful for him, and grateful for you for spending a little bit of time with us this morning. Remember the late Father Ted Ross, who passed away on Sunday at 89. Your fellow member of the Society of Jesus, fellow priest of Jesus Christ, and may the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace, and may perpetual light shine on Father Ted. I pray for the repose of his soul. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, especially the souls of the priests of Jesus Christ, rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.